James Thompson sat in his wheelchair in the hospital corridor, 28 years old with his left leg gone. After that mine blast in Afghanistan, doctors had told him he would never run again. But James had a completely different plan in mind. Such a plan that 18 months later, it would bring millions of people to tears. Where are you watching this story from today? Perhaps from your comfortable home, maybe during your commute to work, or relaxing after a long day. Wherever you are, I'm sure you've never heard a story quite like this one. This is the story of how one moment of devastation became a beacon of hope for millions, and how a man who lost everything found a way to give the world something beautiful. James's background. James Thompson grew up in a small town called Aldershot in Hampshire, England, a place known for its military heritage. His father, Robert, was a former Royal Marine who had served in the Falklands War. His mother, Margaret, was a primary school teacher who filled their home with warmth and laughter. James was their only child, and from the moment he could walk, he was running. Running wasn't just exercise for James, it was his language, his meditation, his way of understanding the world. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., before school, before work, before anything else mattered, James would lace up his trainers and run through the countryside around Aldershot. The rhythm of his feet hitting the ground, the steady sound of his breathing, the way his mind would clear after the first mile. This was where James found himself. At school, he was captain of the cross-country team. At university, where he studied mechanical engineering, he ran competitively for the university athletics club. When stress mounted during exams, James ran. When he had difficult decisions to make, James ran. When life felt overwhelming, James ran. His friends joked that James had been born with springs in his legs and a motor in his chest. After university, James felt called to serve, not because of pressure from his father, but because he wanted to make a difference. He wanted to protect others the way his father had protected their freedoms. In 2015, at the age of 24, James enlisted in the British Army and was eventually assigned to the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment. The military loved James. His fitness scores were exceptional, his determination was unmatched, and his ability to stay calm under pressure made him a natural leader. Within 2 years, he had been promoted to sergeant and was leading a section of 8 soldiers. But more than his rank or his responsibilities, James was known throughout his unit for one thing: he was the fastest runner they'd ever seen. The deployment. In March 2019, James's unit was deployed to Afghanistan as part of Operation Herrick, Britain's contribution to the international mission in Afghanistan. They were stationed in Helmand Province, one of the most dangerous regions in the country. The landscape was harsh, a mixture of desert, rocky terrain, and areas where the Taliban had been planting improvised explosive devices for years. James's job was to lead reconnaissance patrols, gathering intelligence on Taliban movements, and ensuring the safety of the larger base. These weren't glamorous missions. They involved long days walking through dangerous territory, checking for threats, and maintaining a presence that would deter enemy activity. But James loved the work, not because of the danger, but because of the responsibility. He was protecting his soldiers, gathering information that would keep others safe, and serving his country in a way that felt meaningful. Even in Afghanistan, James maintained his running routine. Every morning within the secured perimeter of the base, he would run laps. His fellow soldiers would joke that James could probably outrun the Taliban vehicles if he needed to. The camaraderie among the soldiers was something James had never experienced before. These weren't just colleagues, they were brothers. There was Tommy Mitchell, 22, from Liverpool, who could make anyone laugh even in the worst situations. There was David Clark, 26, from Scotland, who carried pictures of his 2 young daughters everywhere. There was Ahmed Hassan, 24, a British soldier whose family had immigrated from Pakistan and who spoke perfect Pashto. And there was Marcus Wright, 20, the youngest in the group, who looked up to James like an older brother. The mission, September 15, 2019, started like any other day. The weather was clear, which in Afghanistan meant it would be scorchingly hot by midday. James's section had been tasked with a routine patrol to check on a village about 5 kilometers from their base. Intelligence suggested that Taliban fighters might be using the area to move supplies, and James's job was to assess the situation and report back. The patrol began at 6 a.m. when the temperature was still manageable. James led his 8-man section along a route they had traveled dozens of times before. The landscape was familiar: rocky hills, sparse vegetation, and the occasional shepherd with his goats. The local population was generally friendly, though cautious. These people had lived through decades of conflict, and they had learned to be careful about who they trusted. As they approached the village, everything seemed normal. Children were playing in the dirt streets, women were hanging laundry, and the men were gathering for morning tea. James's section spread out to cover more ground, each soldier maintaining visual contact with at least one other member of the team. James was walking point, the most dangerous position, but one he never asked his soldiers to take. As the leader, he believed it was his responsibility to face the greatest risk. Tommy Mitchell was about 20 meters to his right, David Clark was behind him, and the rest of the section was spread out in a careful formation they had practiced hundreds of times. They were checking a compound on the outskirts of the village when James noticed something that didn't look right. There was a patch of ground that seemed to have been recently disturbed. The dirt was a slightly different color, and there were no footprints around it despite being in an area where people usually walked. The explosion. James raised his hand to signal his section to stop. In the British Army, soldiers are trained to recognize the signs of improvised explosive devices, and James's instincts were telling him something was wrong. He spoke into his radio, "Possible IED ahead, everyone hold position." But as he took a step backward to create distance from the suspicious area, James heard a clicking sound under his left foot. In that instant, he knew exactly what had happened. He had stepped on a pressure plate, a simple device that the Taliban used to trigger explosives when someone walked over them. Time seemed to slow down. James looked back at his section, all of whom were staring at him with growing horror as they realized what was happening. Tommy Mitchell's face went white. David Clark started to move toward him. Marcus Wright, the youngest soldier, looked like he was about to cry. "IED!" James shouted. "Everyone get back." In his final moment of consciousness, James had two thoughts. The first was professional. He needed to make sure his soldiers were safe. The second was personal. He thought about his morning run that day, and how it might be his last. The explosion was massive. The sound could be heard back at the base, 5 kilometers away. A cloud of dust and debris rose 30 feet into the air. When it settled, James Thompson was lying unconscious on the ground, his left leg completely severed below the knee, and his right leg severely damaged. Tommy Mitchell, despite being thrown backward by the blast, was the first to reach James. He immediately began applying a tourniquet to stop the bleeding, a skill that every British soldier learns but hopes never to use on a friend. David Clark called for immediate medical evacuation, while Ahmed Hassan and Marcus Wright secured the area to prevent further attacks. The golden hour. In military medicine, there's a concept called the golden hour, the first hour after a traumatic injury, when immediate medical care can mean the difference between life and death. For James Thompson, that golden hour began with his soldiers fighting to keep him alive in the middle of a Taliban-controlled area of Afghanistan. The medical evacuation helicopter arrived within 20 minutes, but to James's soldiers, it felt like hours. They had managed to stop the major bleeding and keep James breathing, but he had lost a tremendous amount of blood and was drifting in and out of consciousness. As the helicopter lifted off, Tommy Mitchell looked down at the blood on his hands, his sergeant's blood, and made a silent promise that he would visit James as soon as he was able. None of them knew if they would ever see their leader alive again. James was first taken to the military hospital at Camp Bastion in Afghanistan, where British military surgeons worked for 6 hours to stabilize him. The left leg was completely gone. There was nothing to save. The right leg was severely damaged, but intact. More concerning was the blood loss and the potential for infection in such a harsh environment. After 48 hours in Afghanistan, James was stable enough to be transported to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, England, one of the world's leading military medical centers. This was where British soldiers came when they needed the most advanced care available. The awakening. James regained consciousness 4 days after the explosion. The first thing he noticed was the ceiling of the hospital room, clean, white, and peaceful. The second thing he noticed was that he couldn't feel his left leg. The third thing he noticed was his mother, Margaret, asleep in a chair beside his bed, holding his hand. When Margaret woke up and saw that James was awake, she began crying immediately. She had been at the hospital for 3 days, barely sleeping, barely eating, just waiting for her son to wake up. Robert, James's father, had been there too, but had gone home to shower and change clothes. "Mom," James said, his voice barely a whisper. "Oh, my darling boy," Margaret replied, squeezing his hand. "You're going to be all right. You're going to be all right." But James could see in her eyes that everything was not all right. He tried to sit up and look down at his body, but Margaret gently pushed him back down. "Don't," she said softly. "Not yet. Let the doctor explain." Dr. Sarah Patel, the lead military surgeon, arrived within minutes. She was a woman in her 40s who had treated hundreds of combat injuries, and she had developed a direct but compassionate way of delivering difficult news. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, pulling up a chair beside his bed, "I need to tell you about your injuries. The explosive device severed your left leg below the knee. We were unable to save it. Your right leg was severely damaged, but we've been able to repair it, and you should regain full function over time." James stared at the ceiling, processing this information. He had known, somehow, from the moment he woke up, but hearing it said out loud made it real in a way that nothing else could. "Will I walk again?" he asked. "Yes," Dr. Patel replied. "With a prosthetic leg and proper rehabilitation, you'll be able to walk, climb stairs, and live a completely normal life." James nodded, but his next question came out as barely a whisper. "Will I run again?" Dr. Patel hesitated. She had seen many soldiers ask this question, and she had learned that honesty was more helpful than false hope. "Running will be challenging. Possible, perhaps, but very difficult. You'll need to focus on walking first, then we can see what's possible." That night, alone in his hospital room, James Thompson cried for the first time since he was a child. Not because of the pain, not because of the fear, but because running had been his identity for as long as he could remember. Without it, he didn't know who he was. The long road,
Recovery was brutal, physical therapy was painful, frustrating, and exhausting. Learning to walk with a prosthetic leg required relearning everything James thought he knew about balance, movement, and his own body. Some days he would practice for hours and feel like he had made no progress at all. The prosthetic leg itself was a marvel of modern engineering, carbon fiber construction, microprocessor-controlled knee joint, and a foot that could adapt to different terrains. But it wasn't his leg, it was a tool, and learning to use it effectively required patience that James had never needed before. Tommy Mitchell, David Clark, and the rest of James's section visited him as soon as they returned from Afghanistan. Seeing his soldiers again was emotional for everyone. They had saved his life, and they had continued their mission after he was evacuated. Tommy had been promoted to sergeant and was now leading the section that James had built. "How's the running, Sarge?" Marcus Wright asked during one visit, and immediately regretted the question when he saw James's face. "I haven't tried yet," James replied. "The doctors say it might not be possible." "Bollocks," said David Clark in his thick Scottish accent. "You're the fastest runner I've ever seen. A bit of metal isn't going to stop you." But privately, James wasn't so sure. He had tried jogging a few steps during physical therapy, and the prosthetic felt clumsy and unnatural. The rhythm that had been second nature to him for his entire life was gone, replaced by an awkward, uneven gait that felt nothing like running. The turning point came 6 months after the explosion, during a routine visit to the prosthetics clinic. James had been fitted with his third prosthetic leg, each one slightly better than the last, as his residual limb healed and his walking improved. He was talking with his prosthetist, a man named David Hughes, who had been fitting prosthetics for military amputees for over 20 years. "I see in your file that you were quite a runner before your injury," David said as he adjusted the fit of the new prosthetic. "I was," James replied, "but that's finished now." David stopped what he was doing and looked at James directly. "Why?" "Because I can barely walk properly with this thing, let alone run." "Have you tried?" "Of course I've tried. It's not the same, it'll never be the same." David nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, it'll never be the same, but that doesn't mean it can't be good. Different, but good." He went to a cabinet and pulled out a tablet computer, scrolling through various videos. "I want to show you something," he said, turning the screen toward James. The video showed a man with 2 prosthetic legs running on a track. Not jogging, not walking quickly, but actually running. Fluid, fast, and graceful. The runner's name was Blake Leeper, an American Paralympic sprinter who held multiple world records. "Both legs?" James asked, staring at the screen. "Both legs, above the knee," David confirmed. "He runs faster than 99% of people with their original legs." James watched several more videos. Paralympic marathoners, military veterans who had returned to competitive running, ordinary people who had learned to run again after losing limbs. For the first time since his injury, James felt something he hadn't experienced in months: possibility. "What would I need to do?" James asked. David smiled. "First, you need to learn to walk properly, then walk fast, then walk very fast. Then, when you're ready, we'll get you a running-specific prosthetic and see what you can do." The training begins. Learning to run again was like learning a foreign language as an adult. Possible, but requiring a completely different approach than what had come naturally before. James had to retrain his brain to understand balance, rhythm, and movement in ways he had never consciously considered. The first few weeks were discouraging. James would manage perhaps 50 meters of awkward jogging before becoming exhausted or losing his balance. The prosthetic felt heavy and unresponsive compared to his natural leg. His gait was uneven, his breathing was labored, and everything about the experience felt wrong. But James was stubborn in the way that only former soldiers can be stubborn. Every day, he would go to the track at the local athletics club and practice. Some days he would manage 100 meters. Some days he would fall and have to start over. Some days he would become so frustrated that he would sit on the track and consider giving up. It was during one of these moments of frustration that James met someone who would change his perspective completely. Her name was Emily Santos, and she was 8 years old, the little girl. Emily had been born with a condition called fibular hemimelia, which meant that she was missing the fibula bone in her right leg. She had been fitted with a prosthetic leg when she was 3 years old, and now, at 8, she was one of the most enthusiastic members of the local children's athletics club. James first noticed Emily during one of his training sessions. While he was struggling to jog 100 meters without losing his balance, this little girl with a prosthetic leg was running laps around the track, laughing and chatting with the other children as if nothing in the world was more natural. After watching her for several sessions, James approached Emily's mother, Carmen Santos. "Your daughter is remarkable," James said. "I'm still learning to run with my prosthetic, and she makes it look effortless." Carmen smiled. "She doesn't know it's supposed to be difficult. To her, this is just how she runs. She's never known anything different. Does she ever get frustrated with it? Sometimes, but mostly she just focuses on what she wants to do, not on what she can't do." That afternoon, Emily approached James directly. "Are you learning to run too?" she asked with the straightforward curiosity of a child. "I am," James replied, "but I'm not very good at it yet." "Want to race?" Emily asked, already bouncing on her toes in preparation. James looked at this 8-year-old girl with her bright pink prosthetic leg and her enormous smile and realized that he had been approaching everything wrong. He had been focusing on what he had lost, rather than what was still possible. "All right," he said, getting into position beside her, "but I should warn you, I'm quite slow." Emily giggled. "That's okay. I'll go slow too." They ran together, a former elite soldier and an 8-year-old girl, both learning to move through the world on artificial legs. Emily won the race easily, but more importantly, James finished it smiling for the first time since his injury. The
That evening, James called his parents with a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "I'm going to run a marathon," he announced. "That's wonderful, darling," his mother replied, though he could hear the concern in her voice. "Are you sure you're ready for something so ambitious?" "I'm not ready now," James admitted, "but I will be. I'm going to train properly, and I'm going to run the London Marathon next year." His father, Robert, understood immediately. "What do you need from us?" "Support," James said, "and maybe help with something else. I want to raise money while I do it." "For what?" James had been thinking about this since his conversation with Emily and her mother. "For prosthetic equipment for children. There are kids like Emily whose families can't afford the best prosthetics. I want to change that." It was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so. James had never run more than a few hundred meters with his prosthetic leg, and he was talking about covering 42.2 kilometers. But for the first time since his injury, he had a goal that felt bigger than his limitations. The preparation, training for a marathon with a prosthetic leg, requires a completely different approach than conventional marathon training. James had to work with his prosthetist to develop a leg specifically designed for long-distance running, lighter than his walking prosthetic, with a different foot design optimized for the repetitive motion of distance running. He also had to relearn everything about endurance. His cardiovascular fitness was still excellent, but his prosthetic leg created different stress patterns on his body. His right leg had to work harder to compensate for the left. His core muscles had to provide additional stability, and his energy expenditure was higher than it had been when he had both natural legs. James started with a goal of running for 10 minutes continuously. It took him 3 weeks to achieve that, then 20 minutes, then 30 minutes, then an hour. Each milestone felt like a victory, but also highlighted how far he still had to go. The training was lonely at first. James would run early in the morning or late in the evening, when the tracks and paths were empty, partly because he was self-conscious about his uneven gait, and partly because he wanted to avoid well-meaning people who might interrupt his focus with questions or encouragement he wasn't ready to receive. But gradually, other people began to notice. Tommy Mitchell and the rest of his old section would join him for training runs when they were on leave. Emily Santos and her mother Carmen became regular training partners for shorter distances. David Hughes, his prosthetist, would attend some of his longer training sessions to monitor how the prosthetic was performing and make adjustments as needed. The setbacks. Training wasn't a straight line of progress. There were setbacks that tested James's resolve in ways that combat never had. 3 months into his training, James developed a severe blister on his residual limb that became infected, forcing him to stop running for 2 weeks while it healed. The loss of fitness and momentum was devastating. 6 months into training, during a 15-mile run, James's prosthetic leg malfunctioned. A component in the knee joint failed, causing him to fall hard on a concrete path. He scraped his hands and face, but more importantly, he lost confidence in his equipment. It took several weeks of testing and adjustments before he felt comfortable pushing his pace again. 8 months into training, James hit what marathon runners call the wall, but his version was psychological rather than physical. He had successfully completed an 18-mile training run, but instead of feeling accomplished, he was overwhelmed by doubt. Could he really cover 26.2 miles? What if his prosthetic failed during the actual marathon? What if he had to stop and couldn't finish? It was Emily Santos who helped him through this crisis of confidence. During one of their training sessions, she asked him a simple question. "Why are you worried about falling down?" "Because it would be embarrassing," James replied. "Because people would see that I can't do it." Emily considered this seriously, as children do. "But you fall down in training sometimes, and you always get back up. Why would the marathon be different?" James realized that Emily was right. He had fallen dozens of times during training, and he had always gotten back up and continued running. The marathon would be the same, 1 step at a time, 1 mile at a time, and if he fell, he would get back up. The fundraising. While James was training physically, he was also working to build support for his fundraising goal. He had decided to raise money for Running Free, a charity that provided prosthetic equipment to children whose families couldn't afford it. James started small, sharing his story with local newspapers and community groups. The response was overwhelming. People were drawn not just to his personal story of overcoming adversity, but to his mission of helping other amputees achieve their own goals. Corporate sponsors began to take notice. A major prosthetics company offered to provide free equipment to children through James's fundraising efforts. A running shoe company offered to sponsor James's marathon attempt and donate shoes to young amputee athletes. A sports nutrition company provided free products for James's training and pledged money for every mile he completed during the marathon. But the most meaningful support came from other amputees, especially children. James began receiving letters and emails from young people around the world who had heard about his story and were inspired to pursue their own athletic goals. Some sent pictures of themselves running, swimming, or playing sports with their prosthetic limbs. One letter came from a 12-year-old boy named Michael in Australia who had lost his leg in a car accident.
Dear Mr. Thompson, the letter read, I saw your story on the internet and I wanted to tell you that I started running because of you. I'm not very fast yet, but I'm getting better. Thank you for showing me that it's possible. The final preparation. As the London Marathon approached, James's training intensified. He was now running 60-70 miles per week, including long runs of up to 22 miles. His times weren't competitive by elite standards, but they were respectable for any recreational marathon runner, and extraordinary for someone running on a prosthetic leg. His longest training run was 22 miles, completed 3 weeks before the marathon. James finished in 3 hours and 12 minutes, which projected to a marathon time of around 4 hours and 30 minutes, well within his goal of finishing under 5 hours. But more importantly than the time was how James felt. For the first 15 miles, he had felt strong and comfortable. His prosthetic leg was functioning perfectly, his energy levels were steady, and his rhythm felt natural. This was the longest he had run since his injury, and for the first time he truly believed he could complete the marathon. The final 2 weeks before the marathon were dedicated to tapering, reducing training volume to allow his body to recover and prepare for race day. James used this time to finalize his fundraising efforts, which had now raised over $50,000 for prosthetic equipment for children. Emily Santos and her mother Carmen planned to be at the marathon to cheer James on. Tommy Mitchell and several of his old section had arranged leave so they could be at the finish line. James's parents, Robert and Margaret, would be tracking his progress using the marathon's mobile app and meeting him at various points along the course. Race day. April 28, 2021, London Marathon Day. James woke up at 5 a.m. in his hotel room near the start line in Greenwich. He had slept surprisingly well, considering the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. His prosthetic leg was laid out on the chair beside his bed, along with his race number, timing chip, and the special running shirt he had designed for the race. The shirt was simple, white with blue text that read "Running for Those Who Can't" on the front, and a list of all the children who had written to him during his training on the back. Emily Santos's name was at the top of the list. James's pre-race routine was methodical, developed over months of training. First, he carefully fitted and adjusted his prosthetic leg, checking every connection point and testing the range of motion. Then he completed a series of stretches and activation exercises designed specifically for amputee runners. Finally, he ate a light breakfast and reviewed his race strategy one final time. The plan was simple: maintain a steady pace of approximately 10 minutes per mile for the first 20 miles, then reassess based on how he felt. If he was feeling strong, he would push slightly harder for the final 6.2 miles. If he was struggling, he would focus simply on finishing. At 7 a.m., James made his way to the start area in Greenwich Park. The London Marathon is one of the world's largest marathons, with over 40,000 participants, and the energy at the start line was electric. James had been assigned to the good-for-age start area, based on his projected finish time, which placed him among serious recreational runners. As James waited for his start wave, he received text messages from supporters around the world. Emily Santos had sent a picture of herself wearing a t-shirt that said "Go James." Carmen Santos had written, "Remember, one step at a time, just like training." Tommy Mitchell's message was shorter but meant just as much: "Show them what the Paris can do, Sarge." The race begins. At 9:40 a.m., James's start wave was released. For the first mile, the course was crowded, and James focused simply on finding his rhythm and avoiding other runners. The early miles of the London Marathon wind through the historic neighborhoods of Greenwich and Deptford, and the crowds were already substantial despite the early hour. James had worried that spectators would stare at his prosthetic leg or treat him differently than other runners, but he quickly realized that in the context of the marathon, he was simply another participant pursuing a personal goal. Other runners nodded encouragingly as they passed. Spectators cheered for everyone equally, and James began to feel like he belonged. By mile 3, James had found his target pace and was feeling comfortable. His prosthetic leg was functioning perfectly, his energy levels were good, and his confidence was building. The first few miles of any marathon are about settling into rhythm, and James was pleased with how natural everything felt.
Miles 4 through 10 took the runners through South London, passing landmarks like the Cutty Sark and crossing Tower Bridge, one of the most iconic moments of the London Marathon. As James approached Tower Bridge, he could see thousands of spectators lining both sides of the Thames, creating a wall of sound that was almost overwhelming. Crossing Tower Bridge was emotional for James in ways he hadn't anticipated. Looking down at the Thames with crowds cheering from both sides, he thought about how far he had come since that day in the hospital when he wondered if he would ever run again. He was now 10 miles into the London Marathon, feeling strong and surrounded by people who were celebrating his achievement. The halfway point. James reached the halfway point of the marathon in 2 hours and 11 minutes, exactly on target for his goal time. More importantly, he felt physically and mentally strong. His prosthetic leg was performing perfectly. He had maintained his target pace without difficulty, and he was actually enjoying the experience. The halfway point of the London Marathon is in Canary Wharf, London's financial district, where tall buildings create an urban canyon effect. Despite being in the heart of the city, this section of the course can feel isolated, and it's where many marathon runners begin to struggle with the mental challenge of covering the remaining 13.1 miles. But James felt different. Instead of being daunted by the distance remaining, he was excited about the opportunity to cover 13 more miles. During his training, 13 miles had been a standard long-run distance, challenging but well within his capabilities. At mile 14, James passed a group of spectators holding a sign that read, "Running free, go James." He realized that these were supporters who had followed his fundraising campaign and come specifically to cheer for him. He waved and smiled, and they erupted in cheers. This moment reminded James why he was running the marathon. It wasn't just about his personal achievement, though that was important. It was about proving to other amputees, especially children, that their limitations didn't define their possibilities. The difficult miles, miles 15 through 20, are traditionally the most challenging part of any marathon. This is where the glycogen stores in muscles begin to deplete, where the repetitive impact of running begins to take a toll on joints and tendons, and where the mental challenge of continuing becomes as important as physical fitness. For James, these miles presented unique challenges. His prosthetic leg required more conscious control than a natural leg, which became more difficult as fatigue set in. His right leg, which was compensating for the prosthetic, began to feel tight and heavy. Most concerning, he began to develop a hot spot on his residual limb, where the prosthetic attached, the early warning sign of a blister that could force him to stop. At mile 17, James made his first strategic adjustment. He slowed his pace slightly and modified his gait to reduce the pressure on his residual limb. The time loss was manageable, but more importantly, the adjustment alleviated the hot spot and allowed him to continue comfortably. At mile 18, James encountered his first moment of doubt. His overall pace was still on target, his energy levels were acceptable, but the effort required to maintain his rhythm was increasing significantly. For the first time during the race, he began to question whether he could cover the remaining 8 miles. It was at this moment that James saw Emily Santos. The inspiration, Emily and her mother Carmen were positioned at mile 18, in an area where spectators were allowed close to the course. Emily was wearing her bright pink prosthetic leg and holding a sign that read, "My hero." When James saw her, both of them began crying. James stopped running and went to the barrier to hug Emily. "You came," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I wouldn't miss it," Emily replied. "How do you feel?" "Tired," James admitted, "but I'm going to finish." "I know you are," Emily said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "Because you're the strongest person I know." Carmen Santos handed James a small energy gel and squeezed his shoulder. "8 more miles," she said. "You've got this." As James resumed running, he carried Emily's words with him. If an 8-year-old girl could see him as strong, then perhaps he was stronger than he realized. The remaining miles were still going to be challenging, but they were no longer insurmountable. The final miles, miles 20 through 26.2 of any marathon, are a test of character more than fitness. James's legs were heavy, his breathing was labored, and every step required conscious effort. But his mind was clear, and his determination was absolute. At mile 22, James passed a group of soldiers in uniform who were cheering for all the runners. When they saw his prosthetic leg and recognized him as a fellow serviceman, they began chanting "Airborne," the battle cry of the parachute regiment. James raised his fist in acknowledgement and felt a surge of energy that carried him through the next mile. At mile 24, with just over 2 miles remaining, James encountered the deepest challenge of the entire race. His prosthetic leg began to feel loose, not dangerously so, but enough that his gait became less efficient, and his confidence began to waver. James had trained for many possible scenarios, but equipment issues so late in the race had not been thoroughly tested. James had 2 choices: stop and try to adjust the prosthetic, which would cost precious time and energy, or continue with the equipment as it was and hope it would hold together for the final 2 miles. James chose to continue, but modified his running style to account for the less secure fit. The home stretch. The final mile of the London Marathon takes runners along the Thames Embankment, toward Big Ben and the Palace of Westminster, some of London's most iconic landmarks. For James, this mile was a blur of emotion, exhaustion, and determination. He could hear the roar of the crowd at the finish line ahead, and he knew that Tommy Mitchell, David Clark, Marcus Wright, and the rest of his old section were waiting for him there. His parents were somewhere in the crowd. Most importantly, he was about to complete something that 18 months earlier had seemed impossible. With half a mile to go, James's pace actually increased.
not because he felt physically stronger, but because he was being pulled forward by the magnitude of what he was about to accomplish. Every step was bringing him closer to proving that his injury hadn't defined his limitations. At 200 meters from the finish, James could see the timing clock, 4:27:33. He was going to finish well under his goal of 5 hours, and his time would be competitive with any recreational marathon runner, regardless of whether they were running on prosthetic legs or not. The finish. James Thompson crossed the finish line of the London Marathon at 4 hours 28 minutes and 17 seconds. As he crossed, he raised both arms in victory, tears streaming down his face, overcome by emotions he couldn't fully process. The finish area of the London Marathon is organized chaos, thousands of runners finishing within minutes, volunteers distributing medals and space blankets, family members searching for their loved ones. James was immediately wrapped in a space blanket and given water, but he was too emotional to process the immediate aftermath clearly. Through his tears, he saw Tommy Mitchell pushing through the crowd, still in his military uniform. When Tommy reached James, he wrapped him in a bear hug that lasted nearly a minute. "I knew you'd do it, Sarge," Tommy said, his own voice breaking. "I bloody knew you'd do it." David Clark, Marcus Wright, and the rest of James's old section arrived moments later, creating an impromptu reunion in the middle of the marathon finish area.
These men who had saved James's life in Afghanistan were now celebrating his triumph in London. James's parents, Robert and Margaret, found him next. Margaret was crying too hard to speak, but Robert managed to say what they were both thinking. "We're so proud of you, son. So incredibly proud." The media response. Word of James's achievement spread quickly. Local news crews had been following his story during his training, and several were positioned at the finish line to capture his completion of the marathon. By that evening, videos of James crossing the finish line were being shared across social media platforms around the world. The fundraising impact was immediate and overwhelming. James's original goal had been to raise £10,000 for prosthetic equipment for children. By the time he finished the marathon, that total had reached £50,000. Within a week of the race, as his story spread internationally, the total exceeded £200,000. But more important than the money was the response from other amputees. James began receiving hundreds of messages from people around the world who had been inspired by his story to pursue their own athletic goals. Parents of amputee children wrote to thank him for showing their children what was possible. Adult amputees shared their own stories of returning to sports and activities they had thought were lost forever. The ripple effect. 6 months after the London Marathon, James received a package that would become one of his most treasured possessions. It contained a medal from a local 5K race, along with a letter from Michael, the 12-year-old boy from Australia who had first written to James during his training. "Dear Mr. Thompson," the letter read, "I finished my first race. It took me 35 minutes to run 5 kilometers, but I finished. My mom cried when I crossed the finish line, just like you did at the London Marathon. Thank you for showing me that I could do this. I'm going to keep running, and maybe someday I'll run a marathon too." Similar stories began arriving regularly. A teenage girl in Canada had joined her school's track team. A man in Germany who had lost his leg in a workplace accident had completed his first triathlon. A woman in South Africa had started a running group for amputee athletes. Each story reinforced for James that his marathon had been about more than personal achievement. It had been about expanding the definition of what was possible for people with disabilities. The speaking career. James's story began attracting attention from corporate and educational audiences who wanted to hear about resilience, goal setting, and overcoming adversity. He was initially reluctant to become a public speaker. His personality had always been more action-oriented than verbal. But when James spoke to his first audience, a group of wounded veterans at a military hospital, he realized the power of sharing his experience. Many of the soldiers he spoke to were dealing with injuries similar to his own, and they needed to see that life after amputation could involve achievement and purpose, not just adaptation and survival. James's speaking style was direct and practical. He didn't focus on inspiration for its own sake, but rather on the specific strategies he had used to rebuild his life after his injury. He talked about the importance of setting goals that were challenging but achievable. He discussed the value of surrounding yourself with people who believed in your potential. Most importantly, he emphasized that setbacks and failures were part of the process, not reasons to quit. The return to Emily. 1 year after the London Marathon, James returned to the local athletics track where he had first met Emily Santos. Emily was now 9 years old, and her running had continued to improve dramatically. She had competed in several local races and was being considered for inclusion in regional youth development programs. But more than her athletic development, Emily's confidence and outlook had blossomed. She had become an advocate for other young amputees, often speaking at school assemblies and community events about disability awareness. When James saw Emily again, he was struck by how much she had grown, not just physically, but in terms of her sense of purpose and leadership. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I grow up," Emily told James during one of their training sessions. "What's that?" James asked.
I want to help make prosthetic legs for other kids, like the ones you bought with your marathon money, but I want to make them even better, lighter and faster and prettier." James realized that Emily had found her own version of purpose through their connection. Just as meeting her had helped him rediscover his potential, his story had helped her envision a future where her prosthetic leg wasn't a limitation, but rather a source of expertise and empathy. The second marathon. 2 years after his first London Marathon, James decided to run again, but this time his goal was different. Instead of focusing on personal achievement, he wanted to run alongside other amputee athletes and help them experience their own moments of triumph. James organized a team of 12 amputee runners, some military veterans, some civilians, some who had been running for years, others who were attempting their first marathon. The group trained together for 6 months, supporting each other through the inevitable challenges and setbacks. Emily Santos, now 10 years old and an accomplished young athlete, served as the team's unofficial mascot and youth ambassador. Though she was too young to run the full marathon distance, she participated in training runs and helped with fundraising efforts. On race day, James's role was completely different than it had been 2 years earlier.
Instead of focusing on his own performance, he spent the 26.2 miles encouraging his teammates, helping them through difficult moments, and ensuring that all 12 members of the team successfully completed the marathon. When the last member of their team crossed the finish line, a 45-year-old woman who had lost her leg to cancer and was completing her first marathon, James felt an even deeper sense of satisfaction than he had experienced during his own first marathon completion. The legacy. 5 years after his injury in Afghanistan, James Thompson had helped raise over £500,000 for prosthetic equipment for children around the world. The Running Free charity had provided prosthetics for more than 200 young amputees, enabling them to participate in sports and activities that had previously been impossible. But the financial impact was only part of the story. James had received thousands of messages from amputees who had been inspired by his example to pursue their own goals, not necessarily in running, but in whatever areas of life they were passionate about. Tommy Mitchell, who had saved James's life in Afghanistan, had left the military and become a paramedic. David Clark had started a non-profit organization supporting military families dealing with combat injuries. Marcus Wright had become a physical therapist specializing in amputee rehabilitation. Emily Santos had grown into a confident teenager who competed nationally in track and field events. She had also started her own charity, collecting used sports equipment and redistributing it to young athletes with disabilities. Her original dream of designing better prosthetics had evolved into studying biomedical engineering, with plans to specialize in prosthetic design. The reflection. On quiet mornings, when James went for his daily run through the countryside around Aldershot, the same routes he had run as a child, he often reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The explosion in Afghanistan had taken his leg, but it had also revealed strengths and possibilities he had never known he possessed. The physical challenge of learning to run again had been significant, but the emotional and psychological growth had been transformative. James had learned that identity wasn't tied to any single ability or characteristic. Before his injury, he had defined himself primarily as a runner and a soldier. After his injury, he had discovered that he was also a fundraiser, a speaker, a mentor, and an advocate. The loss of his leg had forced him to explore aspects of himself that might otherwise have remained dormant. More importantly, James had learned about the power of example. His marathon completion had been meaningful to him personally, but its real value had been in showing other people what was possible. Every young amputee who took up running, every adult who returned to athletics after an injury, every person who set a goal they had previously thought impossible, these were the true measures of his achievement. The final moment. 3 years after his first London Marathon, James received a phone call that brought the entire journey full circle. "Mr. Thompson," said the voice on the other end, "this is Colonel Sarah Harrison from the Ministry of Defense. I'm calling to inform you that you have been selected to receive the MB, Member of the Order of the British Empire, in recognition of your services to charity and sport." James was silent for several seconds, processing the magnitude of this honor. The MBE was one of Britain's most prestigious civilian awards, recognizing exceptional achievement and service to the community. "I'm honored," James finally replied, "but I have to say, I didn't do this alone. There are so many people who supported me, believed in me, and helped make all of this possible. That's exactly why you're receiving this award," Colonel Harrison replied, "not just for what you achieved personally, but for how you've used that achievement to lift up others." The investiture ceremony took place at Buckingham Palace 6 months later. James was accompanied by his parents, Robert and Margaret, who had supported him through every step of his journey. Emily Santos and her mother Carmen were also in attendance, along with Tommy Mitchell and the other soldiers who had saved James's life in Afghanistan. As James knelt before the Queen to receive his medal, he thought about the path that had led him to this moment. It had begun with an explosion in a dusty Afghan village that had nearly ended his life.
It had continued through months of painful rehabilitation and the slow, frustrating process of learning to run again. It had culminated in a marathon completion that had inspired millions of people around the world. But as meaningful as this moment was, James knew that the real reward wasn't the medal he was receiving. It was the knowledge that his story had helped other people discover their own strength and potential. It was the hundreds of children who were now running, jumping, and playing sports on prosthetic legs provided through his fundraising efforts. It was the adults who had returned to athletics after thinking their competitive days were over. As James stood and faced the audience in Buckingham Palace, he saw Emily Santos in the crowd, now 13 years old and wearing her Team GB tracksuit. She had been selected for the National Youth Development Program in track and field. Emily caught his eye and smiled, giving him a thumbs up. In that moment, James understood that his story wasn't really about overcoming disability or achieving personal goals. It was about the connections between people, the power of example, and the way that one person's courage can inspire countless others to discover what they're capable of achieving. The explosion in Afghanistan had taken James's leg, but it had given him something more valuable in return: the opportunity to show the world that human potential is limitless, that setbacks are temporary, and that the most meaningful victories are the ones we help others achieve. His prosthetic leg is now his fourth generation, lighter, more responsive, and more durable than the one he used for his first marathon. But more importantly, running has returned to being what it was in his childhood, not a challenge to overcome or a goal to achieve, but simply the way he starts each day and processes the world around him. The Running Free charity has grown into an international organization that has provided prosthetic equipment to over 1,000 young amputees in 23 countries. Emily Santos, now studying biomedical engineering at university, serves on the charity's youth advisory board and is developing new prosthetic designs that are specifically optimized for young athletes. James has completed 6 more marathons, but he no longer runs them for personal achievement. Instead, he uses each race as an opportunity to run alongside other amputee athletes who are pursuing their own goals. His personal best time remains 4:28:17 from his first London Marathon, not because he can't run faster, but because he has discovered that helping others achieve their dreams is more satisfying than setting new personal records. The soldiers who saved James's life in Afghanistan remain his closest friends. Tommy Mitchell completed medical training and now works as a trauma surgeon. David Clark runs a successful business, providing outdoor adventure experiences for disabled veterans. Marcus Wright became a prosthetist and has fitted prosthetic limbs for several of the children supported by James's charity. But perhaps the most important measure of James's impact is one that can't be quantified: the thousands of people around the world who have heard his story and decided to pursue goals they had previously thought impossible. Some are amputees who have returned to athletics. Others are people dealing with different types of challenges who have been inspired by James's example of persistence and purpose. James often says that the explosion in Afghanistan was both the worst and the best thing that ever happened to him. It was the worst because of the immediate trauma, pain, and loss. It was the best because it forced him to discover strengths he didn't know he possessed, and gave him the opportunity to inspire others to discover their own potential. In the end, James Thompson's story isn't really about running or prosthetic legs or even overcoming disability. It's about the fundamental human capacity to transform tragedy into purpose, to find meaning in suffering, and to use our own struggles as a source of strength for others. And every morning, as James laces up his running shoes and steps out into the Hampshire countryside, he carries with him the knowledge that somewhere in the world, another person is taking their first steps toward a goal they once thought impossible, inspired by the simple truth that human potential has no limits. We only have to be brave enough to discover what we're truly capable of achieving.